Hi, thanks so much for joining me today before I have a chat with Seattle artist Gail Grinnell and Dallas artist Bonny Leibowitz. I was really interested in learning more about how they think about line quality in their drawings. I'm just going to switch screens so we can have a conversation. So Gail, there you are with a lovely little intimate drawing. It looks like that might be on tracing paper.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Well, it's on a thin vellum.
On a thin vellum. Okay.
Yeah.
You know, that's interesting already, but we'll get to that. I'd love to hear more about how you guys make choices about the materials you draw upon. But if anyone wants to be looking at Gail's work while we're having this little chat, you can look her up at gailgrinnell.com. And here's an image of Bonny with her work and an installation. And also feel free to be looking at Bonny's work at her website at bonnyleibowitz.com. So the first image I'm showing here are fairly large scale works. And in thinking about line quality, I had this idea that the two of you had so much in common. And when I started to examine your websites, I was really stunned to see this sort of same shape of paper and sort of a dynamism about the mark making itself. And I love even the titles have a similar sensibility to them. One is called Flow, which is Gail's image on the left, and Bonny's image Passage on the right. So what I'd like to do is just share one by one each of your works, and if you could just tell us a little bit about the work, how you chose the materials that you worked with, and anything you care to share about the mark making itself. So I'm going to go to the next image, which is Gail's piece, Flow. If you would like to take it away, Gail.
Sure. So this is graphite powder and pencils, like soft pencils, on drafting film. So, and it's a material that comes in a big roll. This is an image of it's like an after study of a large installation. So I isolated some parts of that installation and then drew it again to better see it. And that's kind of my ping pong way of working always, is back and forth between large scale, small scale, before and after. It's kind of a way to see things better.
Also 2D to 3D.
Maybe I could say something a little bit about line quality, or about mark making. Sure. At this juncture. So this, one of the things I, really feel strongly about is line is like, it's alive. It has a lot of tension or not tension, depending on your concentration. And it's interactive with itself. And there's some, I guess the thing I would say, maybe just a little brief story about a teacher that I had when I was much younger, who was talking to me about drawing. And one of the things that we did, or that he asked me to do, was to hold a pencil and make as long a line as I could, with as long as I could stay conscious of that pencil in my hand. And when I lost that concentration, I had to stop. And it's actually pretty hard. And it's just a straight horizontal line. And I think I got to 6 feet with concentrating on it. And at that point, I could actually feel through my arm the pencil touching the paper and the paper receiving the line. So that's kind of woo-woo, I know, but actually that is how I think about drawing. So
Connecting that mark to the surface and being in a state of awareness.
Yeah, and that's just like kind of the baseline. And then as you know, time goes on, there's how the lines interact with each other, and whether there's tension between the interaction, whether they almost touch but don't quite, and all those sorts of kind of getting in the weeds about that sort of aliveness of the line. So
there's a nuance there. And as I'm looking at this drawing, another thing I'm wondering about is the negative space where the whites are, if those have been pulled out.
Yes, and line to me it's making a mark with an instrument, it's erasing it, it's pulling it out, that's a line, it's cutting it and combining the cut lines and how they fit together. And I'm sure Bonny can, I sense that there's also that connection between us in terms of how you work with line too, and the way you assemble things. But the assembly is also, it's a drawing to me as well. The large assemblages and the installations are also drawings. They're even actually made of drawings often. Not always, but most of the time.
Let's take a look at one of Bonny's, and maybe Bonny, you can pick up on that idea in this drawing.
Yeah, I very much relate to everything Gail said. And I find it interesting, if I'm understanding correctly, that the drawing that you did, Gail, that we were just looking at is a response to the 3D work as well.
Yeah, a very large installation.
Okay, so I really like that process, because one of the things that I found fascinating that someone talked to me about my work as far as drawing was that sometimes we draw an object and make a painting from some artists. I mean, and there can be any combination. Some people are just drawing, and the drawing is a reaction, an action and a reaction to itself. And then yet you have this after drawing, and I really like that concept as well. So for this piece, this is Passage, and I had a lot of discovery moments as I was making it. I love line quality. I think you were talking about a teacher that influenced you. One of the things that I started out with early on was figure drawing, and I had a passion for figure drawing. And I see a lot of the similar line work that I care about in figure in whatever drawing I'm doing. But one of the things that I find exciting about line is the way it can open up, break up, you can lose it, it comes back again. I'm really interested in the variety of line quality. Not a lot of sameness within the line, and how things can flow and become harmonious because of that variety. And what I remember this teacher saying about my work when I was doing the figure drawing really stuck with me, and I think about it, is that he liked the sense of mystery. So it's, what I like is to break up the object so it is the drawing, so that it has a relationship to the space that it's in. It's you let that what you might call negative space be a part of it, where it really becomes not negative space in a way. It's just part of the overall piece. And so there's some breathing room between just from the openness. And in this particular piece, I was doing what's called a monotype. And so it's a large piece. I was painting on, in this case, doing a monotype with wax, with encaustic. So painting on a large, what's called a hot box. It has to be heated so that you can move the paint on the surface. And then wiping back and pulling back and drawing with different tools onto that surface, that heated surface with various color. And then using that wax, what I did was I then put the paper down and, you know, lightly pressed on the back to pull the image up. Once that was pulled up, that cools rather quickly. And I left lots of white space in there. And what I did was I used that wax as a resist, and all those little lines as a resist, to then go back with ink. And the inks that I used are an alcohol ink, and I don't care for the intensity of alcohol ink straight, so I took them and I mixed them and I added a lot of alcohol to them, so they were really varied from, you know, very you know, translucent and vibrant, to, you know, to kind of muddled and, you know, softer tones. So I have that variety in there, and then, you know, again, some open space. So I was able to paint back into it with some resist. And also when I was doing the encaustic, the wax on the plate, I used some alcohol, which helps separate and break up those waxes in interesting ways. And so that heat like just pushes against the wax and the alcohol and makes things happen that are out of your control. So I find that really exciting. So that's how I worked on this piece. And I think because it's a horizontal, it immediately started speaking to landscape. And so I allowed that element to happen in the work where it became landscape-like.
I love so many things that you brought up about how marks begin to take on their own sort of environment and activating really the spaces between the lines. And so it's not just the lines themselves, but it's those empty spaces that help us see the things that are the lines. Mm-hmm. And that engagement between the two is really what makes a successful drawing. And it's not just left over, you know, it's really activating that space and considering that space. So that's some really beautiful description.
And I loved hearing about the, you know, mess it up and then change it carefully and introduce different materials and see what they do and then work it back into the drawing until you find what it is that you're, how it balances, I guess. I mean, that's what I enjoyed hearing about that, the wax and working back into it and, you know, having some things that are incidental in the process.
I like to think of us as like in concert with materials as opposed to the conductor that's going to control every single thing.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
Another word that comes to mind for me is a responsiveness. So like a real sort of what you brought up in the beginning, Gail, like really paying attention to that connection to the mark and what's happening and, you know, really being present with the marks and not just like randomly drawing and not really paying attention to what the marks are doing.
Yeah, when I say mess it up, I don't mean randomly anything. I mean deliberately introducing something that is not, you're not going to be the main driver for a minute.
Yeah.
Allowing the space for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. And then working, and then that becomes part of the conversation and then working with that. And I think that's important, especially, you know, when if you haven't much experience with drawing, that's a hard one to get to. You know, why I think erasure is nice, because you can smear something in and then you erase back into it and that becomes a line, and then you can trace those lines and you can add things in and take things out. And but it's a surprisingly hard step to make, I think, for most people when they're drawing.
I think it's a certain kind of openness and courage, if you will, not to overstate it, but You know, it's a kind of an act of bravery and
Or discovery,
discovery.
you
Yeah,
know,
just
just
letting yourself
letting
be
yourself
vulnerable.
see it. Yeah, right.
I think that's a perfect segue actually to the next two works, which again, I was quite stunned when I was looking at both of your websites to see the similarity in scale and the same active use of mark making within the works. And maybe we'll go left to right. Gail, if you could tell us just a little bit about the piece and how that relates to drawing in your mind.
Sure. So this is a piece that was created out of many hundreds of individual drawings. But the drawings are, and the drawings are made, well, I'll just say how, so they're like generally about 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide, which is the size of the table they were made on. And they're from a roll of cloth that is a spun cloth. It's not a non-woven cloth that was rolled out on the tables after being treated with some natural dyes and some acrylic. And then I drew with Sharpie pens and onto those, and then those long drawings, and then cut them out. So they're shaped drawings. So they all have holes in them, if you will. All these drawings are pinned together with straight pins, and then they're suspended from themselves to the walls and the ceiling to form a volumetric, it's like cornucopia-like shape, or a horn of plenty. And that was part of that works into the concept of what we were proposing there. That starts up high and comes down very low to the floor. And so that's basically what it was.
So the drawings are being held together in the space by pins?
Yes, corsage pins that have a little, pearl on the end, so
Okay.
that you can find it when you take it apart again. And actually, I really like the way they look too, and how they handle.
Probably catch the light
A
a little bit.
little bit, yeah. And so it has an interior and an exterior. So you stand in front of it, you can look up into it.
Oh, nice.
And then it kind of curls around.
It's amazing that transformation using flat drawings, pinning them together, and making it into this incredible volumetric, bigger than human scale shape that you can sort of enter into in a space, which is similar to Bonny's. And maybe Bonny, you could describe your process in putting yours together.
Well, it's interestingly similar in so many ways, but what about Gail's too, and which happened with this piece in this space, is the organic quality up against the architecture is what's really helps enforce the that juxtaposition, for lack of a better word, is really emphasizes the piece. I love that organic quality, and it's hard for me not to have that in my work. So for me, having rigid lines around the work really helps frame it well and give this nice sense of line in a different way.
Are those monotypes?
These are, and so it's the same process basically that I did with the piece you saw before, the flat image. And so I enjoyed that process so much, I started just making these monotypes that were more abstract, and then finding vignettes in there that I found especially interesting, and would go, I guess my paper at this point I was using was about maybe 50 inches by 40 inches, something like that. And so after I would make my monotype and ink it, I would find big shapes, little shapes, all different shapes. And I so loved just sitting there and cutting them out with a blade. It just, it's just so physical to work in and it's kind of like a little joy to have that break and sit at a table and just cut out little tiny shapes, little holes and big holes and, you know, all of that. And so it was a lot of fun. So yeah, it was the monotypes, then inking, then cutting. And what I knew was that I would be hanging this in a 3D format. So my concern was the backside didn't look as interesting as the front of the monotype.
Mm.
So then I started looking at the backs of them and kind of, if I had tried to print on the back, then it would loosen up the crispness of the wax. So then I would lose that crisp quality. So I didn't want to do that. But I did go back into the back and ink the backs or put some Duralar on the back and, you know, cut that out to make it look interesting on, you know, on both sides. So there was tons of work and like you, tons of cutting. This space that this was in was about maybe 20 foot by 12 foot, and those were 13-foot ceilings, I think, or maybe 14.
Yeah,
And
I have down 23 by 13 feet by 10 inches.
okay. And so I liked, you know, I didn't know where it was going to go when I first started just hanging things. And I didn't use pins to attach them, but later on in some other pieces, I just stapled work sometimes, and I could find staples that were a color that worked with the piece. I love the idea of using implements that work with but in this one, I used a two-face tape that was like a photographer's archival two-face tape, and that held them together pretty well. And so then there you see me like hanging that with filament wire from the ceiling, from a hook that I would put in the ceiling to so I was really just thinking about the space, how it interacts with the piece. And so when, you know, I guess what's also interesting with what Gail was doing is that you have all this small busyness in the piece itself, all of this line quality that, you know, you spent all this time doing every little line, but it's so overwhelming that when someone sees the work, they're maybe not seeing every little line. It's so much, it's so obsessive. And then you're putting it in space that gives it like breathing room so somebody can enjoy it and they could look close up or take it in as a whole. And I find that whole process really interesting as well.
I love that description. And it makes me think of the next two images that I would like to share of both of your works that I noticed were similar in scale and even in form. They're so organic and have so much wonderful line quality in these more sculptural pieces that are more intimate and close up, and entering into a big installation piece like the image before, and then going in closer and looking at smaller objects. Yeah, and maybe Gail, you could give us some background on this piece.
So this is the same material I used in that large installation. And I hadn't, I think in 2000, right in there, I started doing larger installations, which you can see on the website. So there's a progression of them. But this was the base material. So this is spun polyester, and it's dyed with tea, I think is what the color comes from.
Gorgeous color.
And then it's just Sharpie drawings on that material, and it's very translucent, which also then when it's combined with other pieces, like in this collage, you know, the colors change, and you can mess with the textures. And also for the large installations, when you put them together, then they start out relating personally to me, to my size, what I can handle. That's why I did all those drawings that were ways that I could handle them, and I could roll them up, and I could take them somewhere, and then I could recombine them. And then they had they have that material has a lot of transparency, and it has a lot of meaning to me because it's from my seamstress mother's materials that she used throughout her life, starting, well, not throughout her life. I think that stuff came around in the 60s, but by then she was doing a lot of pretty complicated sewing projects where you needed that sort of material, which is just this inexpensive filter material that people use in the garment industry too. So it has meaning to me, and it had transparency and had these different qualities. And so that this drawing that we're looking at is me experimenting with that, layering it. Those are probably many layers. It's not just one layer, and cutting out the layers and then gluing them together and trying them. And the installation, you can think of that as taking those glued layers and blowing them apart and then assembling them in a looser way so the transparencies play together differently. That's how I think of that process anyway.
So you've sort of condensed it here, but
yeah, that was my first. I did a lot of work in the early 2000s with that material, but I layered them literally. And because they were translucent, you could see the drawing through. So I'd do a line drawing on it, glue the same over it, and then line draw on top of that. So you'd have the line underneath interacting with the line on top, if that makes sense, like a layered.
I love how it exists in both flat and dimensional space.
Yeah, and that was just it didn't occur to me to make them. I kept trying to do that, but it took a while for it to occur to me that I actually could suspend them in space and have them float in front of each other and just be attached at little points instead of literally gluing them together.
Right.
So that piece is literally glued together. And
it's a shift,
but it wants to be dimensional.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying. Let's compare.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, let's compare that to Bonnie's.
Yeah. I was just going to say, it's interesting how some experimentation or work like that can be pivotal.
Yeah.
You do something like that and it sets you in a whole new direction. You're like, okay, now, oh, wait, I could do this. And so for you, those transparencies became important in thinking about how to get that just happening in space, by doing that work. This one is a tree branch, which I like the using things, dichotomous materials so that it's you're using, in this case, I'm using natural found object, this tree branch. And I'm using foam on there, 2 different kinds of foam, an expanding foam and a 2-part foam. So I like having something very natural up against something that's manufactured. So, and I just thought it looked kind of bizarre. And this also hangs can hang as a just hanging object from the ceiling. And so what I did was, it was after a storm. I love trees, and I'm always collecting roots, and roots especially. If I can find a tree root, that's fantastic. My students bring me roots, when they find something interesting, because they know I'll be so happy. And so then I put this, this expanding foam on there, which kind of makes that bubbly effect. And then on top of that, I did a 2-part foam intentionally, a very non-nature-like color, so to emphasize the differences. And what I think about line in this one is the edges of the piece and how they interact with the space around them. And then the line that the shadows from those shapes within it create line. So you'll have wide areas of shadow and, skinny and then disappearing and coming back, just like a line on paper with a pencil or any other material will make that line. So there's a certain elegance and then a body-like form and all of those things I think of in drawing and every other way is part of this 3D object.
I think it's really fascinating because it's not, you know, making marks on a page in a traditional sense with a pencil on paper kind of idea, but it is paying attention to the line making of objects, and that form is like a big fat line, as well as those foam marks become, you know, squishy kinds of lines. So it's just really literally expanding on the idea of what lines can be.
Yeah.
And I think
some things disappear and then they get heavy and bubbly and then come back and then thin and then thick. And so just all those variations.
the range of marks that you can have really impacts the final result in a work. Well, I thank you both for spending a few minutes with me. I love having the chance to sort of compare and contrast some of the different ways you've approached mark making and lines in your work. Again, just a reminder to anybody that if you want to look further, you can go to their websites. And yeah, thanks so much, ladies.
Thank you.